Hello and welcome. I'm going to talk about the pilot revamp a little bit and how it affects PvP. This is pretty unscripted, so I might have to cut in a few places, but just bear with me and hopefully I get some good information out here. And I'm not really going to talk very much about the PvE side of things. There's already plenty of better videos on that, by guys like Spencer and all that. So I'm just going to talk about just the things that affect PvP specifically. And also included in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other mechanics changes that we've had that I didn't necessarily do a specific video on, like Hull Image Refractors has some weird behaviors now that kind of change some of my previous videos, but I'm still going to leave those videos up. There's still like good information around them, but there's a couple little changes with that, so I'll talk about that kind of towards the end. So I've got my notes over here to the side. The first one is hold together. The scaling from throttle is doubled. So before, I was already a pretty big fan of this. I use this a lot on my escorts in the commander seat. On a standard, kind of pilot seat escort, I would do something like pilot team 1, scatter volley 1, beam overload 3, which is my main damage. And then in the commander pilot seat, since I'm usually running attack pattern Lambda somewhere, I don't have room for attack pattern Omega, right? So what do I use? It has to be, some kind of pilot ability. So in the commander seat, you basically had hold together, which provided a heal and resistance as well as clearing a hazard debuff. So I used that one a lot, and I just only used it when I was already damaged, so it wouldn't interfere with my temporary hull. Or a lot of people use clean getaway, which is a speed boost. I'll talk about that in a moment. But this change basically, hold together heals the same amount when you're at 0 throttle, but it heals more when you're at full throttle than it did before, as well as giving you damage resistance. It only lasts 8 seconds, so it's not very long. But it is almost 100 damage resistance now, so if you save it for the right moment, and you're in trouble, maybe you got sub-nuked or something and your resistances are gone, you can hit this and you get some decent resistances back as well as a heal. So overall, good change, and just makes that ability that I already liked a little bit stronger. And another thing to note about that is just to make sure there's no confusion, when it says high throttle, it doesn't mean the actual speed your ship is moving. It's the throttle setting in game. So even if your ship is stopped totally dead, like you're stuck in a hold or something like that, if your ship is still set to full throttle, you get the maximum healing and resistance benefit from this. So it's really good for that. The next one, and probably the biggest topic that everybody's been talking about a lot, is pilot team. I think it's nice that it gives you some defense. These defense values are low, but I like that they're not ridiculous. In contrast, during the Intel revamp, they made Intel team give you, for rank 1 it's 30, and rank 3 is 50 defense, which is ridiculous. That probably needed to be something more like this. So on the one hand, I think Intel team has too much defense, considering it also gives you all this other stuff. Pilot team barely gives you anything besides a small speed boost, and defense, and it's like a tiny amount of defense, not really worth talking that much about, but I mean, I'm glad it's there, I guess. But obviously the big one that everybody's really interested in is the immunity to placate, because pilot team, it lasts 10 seconds, and the immunity to placate lasts for the full 10 seconds, and has a global cooldown of 10 seconds as long as you have the personal trait fresh from R&R. So effectively, or theoretically, you could have 100% uptime immunity to placates by rotating pilot teams every 10 seconds. However, in practice, now that it's dropped to the live server and I've had time to test all this stuff, that's not exactly what's happening. Pilot team does make you immune to pseudo submission, the personal trait, and jam sensors, and the placate from clean getaway, I think. I really only tested pseudo and jam. But the other most popular placate in PvP, and the one that most people are using, is the auxiliary to structural integrity field duty officer. When you use Oxysif and someone shoots you, one enemy is placated for 4 seconds, and that's cleared with engineering team currently. I thought it would be cleared with pilot team as well after this patch, but that placate still happens even if you have pilot team active, or even if you get placated and then use pilot team to clear it. That doesn't work. You still have to use engineering team to clear the Oxysif placate. Next one is attack pattern Lambda. The confuse or whatever, it doesn't change anything really. Applying to all weapons is cool. I don't think there's a lot of people out there running torpedo builds in PvP, but it would be cool if there were more torpedo builds in PvP, or if there were a way to make that a little bit more viable. So I like that. Because especially firing a torpedo under spread always hits, right? So spread is not subject to accuracy. But high yield torpedoes and unbuffed just standard torpedoes are subject to accuracy. So if you're shooting somebody that has really high defense and you're trying to land a really big, high yield 3 torpedo hit or something, you can now use Lambda to improve the chances of that hit happening. And that's good. More build types, better for the health of the game. And the accuracy buff got a big increase, up to 65 now at rank 3, as well as perception. The perception buff is huge. So Lambda 1 is still the same at 250, but it used to be that Lambda 2 was 350 and Lambda 3 was 450 perception. Now Lambda 3 grants 750 perception, which is a ton, and should be enough to effectively end Intel team without Exodus or with Exodus up to a certain point, but especially if you combine Lambda 3 with like the Jem'Hadar deflector and tachyon detection field, high aux power, or even emergency power to aux. I mean, just Lambda and emergency power to aux levels 3 combined is 1,000 perception. So you have a base of 5,000 to begin with. That's 6,000 perception right there. Exodus usually tops out around 5,800, 5,850, maybe 5,900 if you slotted a stealth console and you were really trying to push it. But, that helps you target through Exodus much better. The problem with Exodus that I pointed out in a previous video is, and this kind of leads to my next point regarding both placates and stealth and Exodus and all that stuff. Lambda still has a negative perception debuff applied to your target. So if I'm running Exodus and someone else is running Lambda, even if they have Lambda and whatever, if I shoot them with my Lambda, they lose 450 perception. So to make that easier to understand, it effectively means that I have 450 more stealth, at least as far as a 1 versus 1 fight is concerned, where I'm constantly applying the Lambda effect. Now, Lambda can be cleared if my enemy uses tech team, but then it just reapplies after 5 seconds. So they could get like a little window to shoot back, maybe, but it's such a tight tolerance, and tech team causes problems with like beam overload misfires and all these other things. So there's a lot of drawbacks to using tech team, actually, depending on the situation, that the Exodus user doesn't have the same drawbacks, right? So that was like something I pointed out in a previous video that bothered me about Exodus. And the change to Lambda does improve that a little bit, but either way, it doesn't. I wish they just removed the perception debuff entirely, but it doesn't make a huge difference to me personally because, I mean, I do some 1v1s like for fun and all, but it's not really my focus of the game. Like, I am really interested in team PvP, and the placate and Exodus thing is primarily effective in 1v1 type fights, which is also what, pisses a lot of people off. You go into a 1v1 with someone and they're running Exodus and placates and like all this other stuff, and you can't even shoot at them, and players get really frustrated and quit, because they feel like they're abusing the mechanics, and they are to some degree, but like the Oxysif placate, it only placates one attacker. And the Lambda debuff only reduces the perception of the one person that you're also shooting. So in a team fight, like if somebody is applying Lambda to me, then usually I'm trying to shoot somebody else, and then my teammate is shooting them, and it's a little more dynamic. It's not like when you're in a 1v1, any possible flaw or issue with the, the mechanics or your build or your piloting, it brings that issue to the forefront, and that's something that bugs people. And speaking also, I have a note here to talk about the Oxysif placate. Something that people don't realize, I guess, is so it only placates one person. Whoever the first person to attack after activating Oxysif gets placated for 4 seconds, unless they hit engineering team. I already covered that. But it's the first anything to attack. That could include NPCs or pets or summons or beacons or whatever, which is also why you'll see, like in some of my 1v1 videos or other fights that you've seen, people are calling in things like the Delta Reinforcement Beacon and the Herc Beacon, or whatever they have, and they're not just doing that for like the flavor of it because it's fun, or it's not like those summon ships are dealing any appreciable damage. I mean, they deal such like tiny meaningless amount of damage, but what they do is they consume the placate effect. So like if I'm fighting somebody and I spawn in 3 random Delta fighters, and one of those ships shoots and gets placated, then I don't have to worry about being placated for the next 10 seconds. So it gives you a window of opportunity to attack. So if you're in a 1v1 with someone and they are using, Exodus and placates, it's really easy now. You just equip Lambda for perception and then spawn in a beacon, and time it at the right moment when you're going to make your attack run. And obviously they're going to make it as hard as possible for you to do that, because they'll play defensively for a few seconds until your pets despawn or whatever. But that's part of the game. It's like you're always trying to one up each other and score the kill, and that's what makes it fun. So this one, I normally wouldn't refer to it in PvP, but Fly Her Apart, I think, maybe has some bearing, especially for like a more vapor type build, because the buff it got's pretty good. You get the damage buff during the effect as well as after for 15 seconds. So right now, rank 3, which can go in your commander slot and therefore doesn't interfere with Beam Overload 3, potentially could be 45% bonus damage, which is more than Superior Pedal to the Metal. It's more than the Best Diplomat, or a number of other traits that would improve Beam Overload. And it also applies, it's all damage, not just weapon damage. So like if you're running a science ship and also using Fly Her Apart, you now could get some bonus damage for your gravity wells or torpedoes, or there's I have some ideas about how to use that, but it seems to be pretty good, and it also gives you a pretty large speed boost, which maybe you don't want when you're trying to deal damage, but to mitigate that some, maybe you could do a build like all arrays or all turrets or something. And even though you're going fast, you're just flying circles around your enemy, and this whole time you've got, 45% bonus damage plus, whatever else. And that could be pretty good. So I think that there's some potential there. It does damage you while it's active. It takes away 3% of your max hull every second that it's active. But it does, on PvP builds, you're healing so often and so rapidly that it probably isn't as huge of a concern there as long as you have constant healing going. So there's ways to mitigate that damage that you're taking. The next one is Clean Getaway. So this one is probably the one I'm the most worried about because of the duration increase. It's already pretty easy to just run away from a fight or escape situation. There's tons of universal consoles that do that. There's Impulse Burst Capacitance Cell and Personal Wormhole Generator and like all these things, to get out of the way. And now Clean Getaway, I think, has a global cooldown of 15 seconds, I think. And Clean Getaway 3, the duration is now 12 seconds long. I mean, that's like... if you wanted to run away from a fight, you could basically be untouchable. You could fly in, land a couple of hits, and then just like fly off to the corner of the map or whatever, and then turn around and nobody's got you. And granted, there is a reaction to that. Like if I'm in that PvP match, I will probably equip Clean Getaway myself and kind of try to play like an interceptor role. I'll chase down the person that's running away, but I still don't think that promotes really fun gameplay. You know, if everybody's just running from each other and nobody stays in the fight long enough, I don't know. I mean, on the I don't usually watch a lot of the 10 forward streams, but I did watch the 10 forward this week with Jonathan on, and he seemed very knowledgeable, and he even mentioned some of the changes for PvP. And I think it's cool to hear someone actually, you know, mention that they made some changes and kept PvP in mind when making those changes. That's huge. That's a huge step in the right direction for, you know, this community. And really the game as a whole. But he mentioned, someone had asked something about creating a 1v1 PvP queue. And he responded really positively to that. And I think that would be cool. I think it would be really cool to have a 1v1 PvP queue, just to mess around or whatever. But like an ability like this, imagine in a 1v1 PvP queue, and you come up against someone who's using, you know, the Placates and the Exodus or whatever, and then you're fighting them, and you finally damage them, and they hit clean Getaway, and they just fly off to the corner of the map and wait 2 minutes for all their abilities to recharge, and then they come back to fight you. I mean, that wouldn't be fun for anyone. You know, like, that would suck, honestly. So I'm a little worried that this makes it, you know, a little too easy to do that. I mean, it already at 8 seconds was easy to do that, so I'm not sure it needed this duration buff. You know, adding this thing to it is cool. It doesn't do a lot, but it does reward you for getting away, which, you know, is a valid tactic, I think, but I don't think it needed the duration buff. So all right, so the next really big one that everybody's talking about, obviously, is the reroute reserves to weapons. A lot of the, you know, more intricate math-oriented people have calculated this out, and supposedly the rank 3 version with 225 haste is about 1.7 times final modifier more damage than Beam Overload 3. Which is a huge increase. Most of the abilities prior to this patch were within a few percentage points of each other, you know, but this makes it way, way more powerful than any other fire mode single target. But it does have a lot of drawbacks, and the primary one is that your engine power is being drained when firing while this is active instead of weapons power. But your actual weapon damage is still based on your total weapons power. So you still have to have as close to 125 weapons power as possible, even though it's draining engine power when firing, in order to maximize your damage from the ability. That basically means in order to, the other thing is that the ability cancels early if your the ability cancels early if your engine power runs out. So if you have, and I tested this, if you have 125 engine power and you fire off all your weapons, especially at that really, really high amount of haste, you can drain your engine power to 0 in 2 or 3 volleys. And as soon as your engine power touches 0, the effect ends and you lose your buff. So what you want to do is you want to keep that buff up for the full 10 or 15 seconds. If you have Vanguard Specialists from the legendary Jem'Hadar attack ship, it does extend this to be 15 seconds long, so effectively global cooldown. You could, in theory, keep this up 100% of the time, but you're constantly fighting to keep your engine power up. So in order to keep your engine power up, you have to use something like Enhanced Induction Coils, which grants you something like 60-some engine power for 30 seconds with a 1-minute cooldown. So it's only half uptime, but it does help you a lot. And then, you know, 1 or 2 maybe EPS consoles. I got 2 PAX EPS consoles from Discovery Rep for testing. And I'll put up my video footage of testing this build out in Karat earlier today, and I'll share that build as well at the end. But I mean, you can look at it and make fun of me and probably laugh about how bad it is, because it did not end up being effective at all, really. Oh, and remember I said that if your engine subsystem gets disabled, then you lose the effect. Really popular trait in PvP is viral impulse overload, which is a reputation trait that a lot of people run. It works really, really well against escorts for slowing them down and killing their resistances from rhythmic and that sort of thing. So if someone is running that and they shoot you and your engines dip offline, then you also lose your offensive damage buff. Basically, you're putting all your eggs into the engine basket. And if anything goes wrong with your engine subsystem at all, you lose everything. So, and in my testing, and I don't know if this is intended or not, but if you're running enhanced induction coils, it supposedly makes you immune to engines offline, as well as aux offline and weapons offline. But the Reroute Reserves ability will still turn off if your engine power touches 0. So even if you're running that and your engines don't technically go offline per se, you still lose the buff if you touch 0 or if someone uses an engine disable on you. Even though it's instantly cleared by having that console active, the effect of Reroute Reserve still ends and you're stuck on cooldown for the next 10, 15 seconds or whatever until you can use it again. So that's a bit of a drawback. And one other thing I wanted to mention was I usually use Rhythmic Rumble and slowing down. When you fire your weapons, if it's tied to engine power, as your engine power drops, your ship also slows down. That makes sense, obviously. And if your ship is slowing down and you're using Rhythmic Rumble for your resistances or whatever, you're reducing your resistances. You're making yourself more fragile as your engine power drains. And on top of that, when you use Rhythmic Rumble, it reduces the weapon power cost of firing weapons. However, it does not reduce the engine power cost. So even if you had, negative 100% weapon power cost from Rhythmic, the engine power being drained by Reroute is always the same. So actually in my test build, I ditched Rhythmic Rumble altogether, and I put Plot Armor in instead, because Plot Armor at least is, even though it's only 15 seconds, it is a guaranteed 250 resistances and some healing. And I thought, that's probably better than Rhythmic for this specific situation where I'm not really dealing with weapon power cost. Right, so the other drawback of Reroute Reserves to weapons, and related to the reason why I chose Plot Armor as my heal on this, is that it locks out all of your other fire modes. So it locks out Cannon, Scatter, Volley, and Beam Overload, and Surgical Strikes, and all that stuff. And the trick that a lot of people do in PvP, this is the builds that are on this channel are like this. I have both Cannon, Scatter, Volley, and Beam Overload, and they are both proccing colony consoles for my healing, and that's what's keeping me alive. If you can only proc one of them, you're effectively at half the amount of healing that you had before. And Reroute Reserves does that same thing. If you activate Reroute and your colony consoles proc, then you have there's no secondary proc to keep them going extra, so you're more fragile in that case. And for my test, I actually put on a bunch of vulnerability exploiters, just to try to maximize the amount of damage I could get out of this. Like, I knew I would be fragile and that if anybody shot at me, I'd be in trouble, but I just wanted to see if I could get any appreciable damage out of this at all. And I think ultimately I ended up dealing less damage than if I just done my standard Beam Overload layout instead. So, and then one other minor thing to mention, and the reason why I use the Romulan ship for this, the Singularity Core, gives you a couple of Singularity abilities. One of them is Singularity Overcharge. And Singularity Overcharge essentially is like a Beam Overload ability that you can activate. Normally, it is locked out by other fire modes, but it's not locked out by Reroute Reserves to weapons. So you could theoretically combine Reroute Reserves to weapons and Singularity Overcharge for a really, really huge, basically 225% haste Beam Overload, attacks for a few seconds and deal a lot of damage. And I tested it in PvE, and it's awesome. It does a ton of damage. But the Singularity Core also puts you more at risk of losing power, because you have to have enough weapons power to maximize your damage, but then because you have a Singularity Core, you have 40 less power across the whole ship. So you're suffering a little bit there and trying your best to make up for it with enhanced induction coils or whatever, but ultimately, you know, you're still struggling there because of that. And on top of that, one of the main reasons to even use a Singularity Core ship in PvP, and the reason why the Khalil Engineering Pilot Warbird and the Talis Temporal Pilot Warbird were so popular, is the Singularity Core ability called Warp Shadows, which basically it teleports your ship a little short distance, which is enough to break you out of like ice and Parliament Bubble and like all these things that slow you down. And it also creates some shadows around you, and it gives you a certain amount of stealth. The amount of stealth it gives you is only, I think, 6,000, which used to be a lot, you know, in the old days of the game. But now people have so much perception, I don't even think 6,000 stealth is enough. You know, if someone is running a full like anti-Exodus setup, 6,000 stealth, they can still target you anyway. So, but if you're using Overcharge, then you don't have that escape ability as an option. So yet another thing that makes you easier to be killed. So I don't think Reroute Reserves is going to make a big impact in PvP. Maybe you could use it, again, kind of like the Fly Her Apart. You could use it as some kind of like vapor type thing. You know, you come in, you deal as much damage as you possibly can over like 10 seconds, and then you just like fly off as fast as you can. I guess it's good that you can't use Clean Getaway 3 and Reroute 3. But, you know, even with Clean Getaway 1 or whatever, you hit that and fly off. And that's kind of how I set up the build that I was testing as well. As I intended basically to decloak into combat, deal as much damage with Reroute over 10 seconds, and then escape and then, you know, come about and try it again. But it didn't really work quite that well for me, but maybe someone else can figure out a trick to make it better. Okay, I have one more point about Reroute, and the reason why it'll be great in PvE, but not really big in PvP. And it's about the way that we value damage dealt in PvP, and I'm going to have to read my notes a little bit here to make sure I say what I mean. But in PvE, your average TFO is usually a couple minutes long, right? You have, you know, even your fastest TFO infected, unless you have some of the really high DPS people with you, you're looking at, you know, 30 seconds or a minute or 2 minutes or whatever combat. And when you look at a parse, like to check your damage and your performance, you're looking at your total damage averaged out over the course of that entire length of combat. So in PvP, and I'm not going to say that sustained, like continual damage is worthless, but say, for example, you have 2 ships, and over 1 minute of combat, the first ship deals 100,000 DPS consistently the whole fight. So a grand total of 6 million damage, which is a pretty good amount of damage. The second ship, it only deals 20,000 DPS, so substantially less DPS, and it only deals 1 million total damage, but all of that million damage is condensed into 2 5-second windows 30 seconds apart, and only against an enemy player ship, not any pets or summons or NPCs. Which one do you think is more effective and more likely to have scored a kill for their team? The answer is the second one. And it's the same reason why PvPers say a lot that DPS doesn't matter. It's not that damage doesn't matter, it's that dealing the damage within a really, really short time frame is more advantageous than dealing it over a long period of time. I'm not saying to go turn your weapons off and only shoot every 30 seconds, but what I am saying is that single target damage in PvP dealt in a short window of time is what you're trying to do. It gives your enemy less time to think, react, escape, or heal. It's also why people who aren't PvPers get frustrated in PvP, because they're used to measuring their ship's performance over a period of time, and it's also why people are saying stuff like, oh, you have people with 1 million DPS ships, how can I expect to compete with that? When in reality, a 1 million DPS ship would perform pretty poorly in PvP because it doesn't have any survivability and so on. All right, I have a little tip about parsing PvP fights to ascertain how well your build is performing. If you're using a parsing tool, in this case like SCM, this is the combat log from a fight earlier in Karat. So there's a whole ton of people involved in this fight, and it lasted a pretty long time. My combat duration was, 5,000 something seconds. That's 89 minutes. So an hour and a half of fighting in Karat with, all these people. And some people don't stay the whole time. Some people stayed for, longer periods of time. But either way, when you look at the total amount of damage, obviously the parse is centered on my ship. So if some people were fighting, far off in the corner of the map, I didn't get their damage values. That's how parsing works in this game. There's a limited range for it. But this makes me look pretty good, right? I did way more damage than anybody else. I did more DPS than anybody else, and all this stuff. But this information on this screen, it doesn't really matter. Like deaths, maybe, and healing, maybe total damage in. Like this stuff maybe is interesting, but, or like max one hit, that's kind of interesting, maybe. But anything related to damage, one hit included, this parse includes damage to like pets and other stuff. So basically what you want to do is click on this player combat analysis reports thing. It'll bring up a detailed summary. And if you choose your handle here at the top, and then change your analysis report to damage 2, it'll show you how much damage you dealt specifically to enemy players. So like not Dis Adams is a player, Sal is a player, Bash the Stampede is a player, Stem, Vanyo, Trixia, Red Ranger. But if you look at my parse here, I dealt over 1 million of my damages to a tactical cube, and then I dealt all this damage to like cubes and spheres, and this is in between fights. When I'm waiting for something to happen, I'm just flying around shooting Borg and stuff. And that skews my numbers a lot though. Like my total damage, look at all this damage I dealt to stuff that didn't matter. But on the other hand, I dealt, 7 million damage here to Adams. This was a duel, I think a fight that we did. But I didn't kill him. So, but here's one, like I did kill Sal once. I dealt 1.8 million damage to him. Either way, what I'm saying is that in PvP parses, you want to look at your damage specific to enemy players. And if you want to find out if something is working, you can also click on the individual ability on this filter. Like, let's see. Here's one. Dark Matter, Quantum Torpedo, right? Let's see how much damage that did to players. Almost nothing. It barely went off at all, but Graviton Implosion. So that did pretty good damage to players. But, you get what I'm saying. If you look at, if you look at a lot of this stuff, like Technical Overload, it did do some pretty good damage to these players, but it also did a lot of damage to pets and stuff that aren't that important. Obviously, I still think Technical Overload is good. I'm just saying, when you're parsing builds and you're looking at these things, you got to weigh out all these options and see what's actually performing against player ships. And it's also, there's another parser, the Hilbert parser. If I bring up my handle here, there we go, and I go into a parse on this, like here's an arena from a while ago. This parser actually shows this plus P and plus N column. It actually separates how much damage you dealt to players versus NPCs in the parse, which is really useful information to have. Like George, I'm going to pick on him a little bit. He only contributed to killing 2 players, or roughly 2 players, out of his team's total 15 kills, but he killed 576 NPCs. Killing NPCs, there is something to be said for general crowd control, just to reduce clutter on the map and reduce lag by destroying, pets and pet spawns and stuff really lag up the map because it's a different entity to, for the game to process. So it's not like this damage is worthless. It's just less valuable than damage to players. So really the best player on this team was Evil Jacob for contributing the most amount of damage directly to enemy players. And then on my team, Matt Duty also did quite a bit of damage to players. I actually didn't do that well. I only contributed 4 and died 4 times, so this was definitely not my best match. But Tobix here, this is a healer, so it's a little bit different. His stats, should be focused primarily on this healing value, which was the bulk of our team. So he did accomplish his goal. But probably he's using Fire at Will and Suppression Barrage, which means he's mostly touching NPCs as far as damage. Now that effect still helps our team in a way that isn't represented on a parser. And that's another, I mean, I could do a deep dive on parsing and build measuring that's like totally separate from this. Like, you could have a build that parses very poorly, but if you're healing or suppressing or controlling enemies, you know, like I could deal 0 damage to someone, but if I lock them down and they can't move for 30 seconds at a time, and I'm in a control build, then I'm doing my job, and that's good for the team. I just need a teammate to come in and like finish off the actual kill. That, you know, doesn't translate well to a parser because the parser is only detecting actual damage being dealt. It doesn't measure like, you know, how effectively the enemy is being suppressed or how effectively you're controlling the enemy. So that one you have to like, in my case, like I think I'm already pretty decent at it, but when I was trying to improve at it, I recorded videos and then I watched back what was happening. And I would look and I would see like, oh, you know, if I had used, you know, hostile acquisition at that moment, I could have stopped them from escaping and we could have gotten a kill, but I missed it, you know, whatever. And I remember that for the next time I fight. Like, oh, okay, that's the same situation again. I should use a hold right now to stop, you know, so we can score the kill or whatever. So anyway, and then the very last one, totally not PvP oriented, but I still wanted to mention it. Reinforcement Squadron. Because this bonus is from accuracy, when they announced this before, and I saw the tuning here, 3 times your accuracy plus crit severity becomes bonus damage. I knew that I would have a really ridiculous scaling on this, so I'll put that tooltip screenshot up so you can see. This is fully buffed. This isn't my idle stats, but I thought it was pretty funny to see over 1,000% bonus damage for Reinforcement Squadron. And I did test it anyway in PvE in a patrol, and even with 1,000% bonus damage, it still sucks. The fighters you summon in, they fly in, and they kind of do this like, they drop this coolant stuff, and then they sort of split off, you know, in different directions, kind of like the Thunderbirds or something like that, you know, like an air show. And it looks really cool, but they do terrible damage, even with this crazy amount of bonus damage. So it's funny, but it's not really worth it. And a lot of people asked about this on the stream in regards to carriers, and that makes me laugh a little bit too, because I mean, it could happen. But I highly doubt we're going to get a 2 hangar bay carrier with full pilot spec that can actually use this ability. I mean, I'm just imagining a ship like the Jupiter doing a pilot role, and it just makes me giggle. But, you know, maybe we could see an escort carrier or strike wing or whatever they're called now. Like, I would love for them to revamp the Akira and make the Akira full pilot spec or full command spec, or just anything better than the Akira that we have now, because the Akira is my favorite Star Trek ship. So I want to see that ship, you know. I would like to use the Akira in PvP, but the current Akira, it's a huge handicap in PvP, so I won't use it. And, you know, I would like to be able to fly an Akira. All right, I have a couple other little things to talk about just related to sort of the just general state of the game that I haven't necessarily had time to do a, you know, specific video on, or didn't really fit anywhere else. And the first one I want to talk about is Hull Image Refractors. It had its behavior changed a little bit, kind of a while back, but I never really talked about it in great detail. But basically, Hull Image Refractors used to be that you got 20 stacks of temporary hull. Any healing that exceeded 100% hull gave you a stack of temporary hull, and you could have 20 stacks of that. Whether those stacks were 5,000 each, or 10,000 each, or 20,000 each, depended on whatever heal you put into it, which is part of the reason why colony consoles were so powerful. And anything you did to increase the amount of healing from colony consoles was so important, such as if you had the Miracle Worker set here and you got this extra 30% to incoming healing, that's 30% more effective colony consoles. So that was a pretty good way to get these crazy, crazy temporary HP numbers. And it's also why you couldn't really use small heals. I have a video, I'll throw a clip in right here from that video about healing that I did a while back, where essentially if you used like hazard emitters, when you had a ton of temporary hull, it effectively would erase by overwriting your temporary hull stacks with smaller ones. So you inadvertently were subtracting hull away from yourself. So most escort builds for a really long time only used colony consoles for healing. Now that the behavior's been changed, you have one temporary hull, if I hit it here, it's this icon. You have one pool of temporary hull. If I hover over this, my ship here, you can see 6% in pink. The pink numbers are the amount of temporary hull you have. So you have one temporary hull pool, which is the exact same size as your ship's temporary hull, or at least it's supposed to be. It's a little bit higher on my screen there for a second. I'm not sure why. Now it's back. I don't know. Anyway, now though, you can fill your temporary hull pool. And any amount that you have basically caps out instead of letting you just go crazy with a size limitation. But the advantage is, if you really wanted to, you could combine like colony consoles and plot armor and concealed repairs and hazard emitters. You could use a whole bunch of healing things if you really wanted to. Alright, so let me demonstrate the colony console bug. Basically, a colony console, whenever you activate a fire mode, gives you a % chance to heal for a sizable amount, and you get a chance per console. So if you activate a fire mode, well, on this ship where I have 4, that means that I have 4 separate 25% chance to activate these consoles and heal my ship. And if I activate 2 of them at once, if I'm lucky that way, then both of them or multiples of them will heal me as long as I'm in my green temporary, or my green regular ship hull. With temporary hull, it used to be that each one also gave you a separate stack of temporary hull. However, the new way that it works, where you just have the one large pool, when you're in temporary hull, even if you have multiple colony consoles on your buff bar, you only get one, only one of them actually provides you a temporary hull. And I assume this is a bug, but honestly it's probably for the better anyway to work this way, to make the ships a little more fragile. I mean, you've seen some of my my other videos, and there's a lot of videos that I don't upload or stuff that I cut because it's like half an hour long before anyone dies, and it's like, who wants to watch that because nothing's happening? So let me demonstrate real quick. Let me shoot my ship down a little bit here. Okay, so I only have 36%. If I hit a colony console, there's the buff icon for it. I only got 1, but let me do it again. Okay, so now 2. So if you look, you see how I have separate 2 ticks going up, restoring my ship? But when I'm in temporary hull, so let me activate again here. And it's per fire mode, so you can technically get 2 going at once if you get a proc from each. But like if I hit rapid fire and I get, so I only got 1 there, so let me show what that's doing. So yeah, it's adding 4250 each time. What's it say on the tooltip? 4250, yeah. So it's adding 4250 hull each time with 1 proc. There we go. 2 of them procced. But look. Only 1 of them actually stacked. 25% a hull, even though I had 2 of them, and it should have been 50%. So there you go. the bug is still there. Look at that, got 4 of them now. So that should be full health, but it's going to stop at 75. See? So, yeah, basically that interaction is bugged and kind of behaving in a funny way. And related to that, and I'm not going to do a whole thing on it just because, but I acquired the Vulcan Cheval ship for the trait Totally Out of Control. And I tested it on Tribble. I don't have it on live. It was a Tribble only test. And essentially that trait gives you 200% crit severity for 4 seconds, as long as your shields are above 80% when you use a shield heal. So it's a really, really small window of opportunity anyway, but this is PvP, and I just talked about how important it was to deal damage in that small window of time. But the key on that trait is that your shields have to be over 80%. And it doesn't just mean like your actual ship shields, right? It also means like your shields here. The game treats temporary hull like a shield. So for example, if I activate these consoles and I go into the pink here so that I have 25% temporary hull is filled, that means that I do not have 80%, which is the requirement to get the damage buff from that trait. So besides the really, really small window and forcing you to use a shield heal every 20 seconds, so, you know, like you might use your science team at an inopportune moment when, you know, you might need to save that science team for later. I mean, I still think the trait has a ton of potential for a certain type of build, but if you have a lot of temporary hull, like you're a standard dogfighter kind of build, I don't think it really works for that, because you have to consistently be at over 80% of your temporary hull in combat. And I mean, like, I'm a pretty good pilot, I think, but I don't think I could rely on a trait that is only effective occasionally in combat, especially for the, well, that's not including the cost. I mean, the ship that it comes on is promo ship, so you're talking an insane amount of EC, or you'd have to be crazy lucky to get one, I guess. But very, very unlikely to work all that effectively. Now, you could, you know, here's an option. If you are going to use that trait, you could ditch your temporary hull entirely. And then since you don't have temporary hull, you know, you just keep your healing constantly going and just pretend like you don't have temporary hull at all. And then the trait will work perfectly for you. So that's an option too. If you do have that trait, or you're thinking about getting that trait, just drop your temporary hull altogether and then you don't have to worry about it. But that also restricts you. In this test, I actually do not have any reputations on. Miracle Worker gives you temporary hull. I forgot where it is, somewhere. Miracle Worker gives you temporary hull. Strategist gives you temporary hull. So that restricts also which specializations you can use as well. But if you're doing that, you're probably going for all-out damage. I don't know if Intel gives you any temporary hull somewhere, but if it doesn't, maybe you could do like Intel Constable or something. I mean, like I said, I think it has possibilities, but it is kind of restricted. You have to work around making that work. And honestly, that's a good thing. There should not be a trait in the game. I mean, when I saw that came out, I was pretty annoyed, but it turned out to not be that good anyway. But putting a trait into the game on a promo ship that's 200% crit severity, even for a short duration like that, it really feels like they're trolling PvP specifically. But anyway, I feel like there was something else I wanted to talk about, but kind of forgotten it. This video is already probably going to be way too long. So either way, thanks for watching, and I'll try to stream some or upload some videos. Someone asked me to stream the other day, and that's not something I normally do, but maybe I'll look into it. Try to get some arena fights going tomorrow night, Friday night, with the pilot changes, and, you know, maybe have some fun doing that later. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Have a good one.